private sector, they don't do charities. The main aim of an enterprise is profit maximization. Let's be clear and upfront about that. So water becomes business to them.
Neil here. Thanks for listening to On the Green Fence and rating or reviewing us wherever you get your podcasts. This is the third episode of our water series, and today I'm looking at whether the privatization of water is a good or a bad thing. Over the next 4 decades, water use is expected to triple amid population growth. It's going to be a huge challenge to ensure that everybody has easy access to affordable drinking water, especially against the backdrop of climate change, which is also impacting on the water cycle, as we discovered doing this series. Now, some argue that the privatization of water could lead to better pricing, less waste, and better distribution, even to the world's poor. But is that really true? I'll be discussing precisely that question with Naren Prasad today. He's a water policy expert and researcher from Fiji who currently heads the UN's International Labour Organization's Education and Training Programme in Geneva, Switzerland. And before joining the United Nations, he was with a major French water company. He didn't want to give me their name, but he told me that this brief episode in the private sector was a very formative experience for him. So let's dive straight into that interview right there.
In fact, I was trained in the water business. One of the big multinationals, they recruited me, they trained me. And the idea was they send me back to the Pacific Islands, to New Caledonia, to Vanuatu, to Fiji, and then work with them in order to privatize the water systems there so that those companies can buy them. So I stayed there 6 months with them, no more. And then I resigned from them because I didn't feel that what we were doing at my heart, the principles I had, did not correspond to what the company was asking me to do.
What principles did you feel were being broken?
Okay, first thing is that I consider water as a human right. Water means many things to many people. Water is life. Water is also related to our hygiene, health issues. Water can be cultural, water is spiritual. Water is also economic in a sense for generating enterprises and productive issues. Water is life, as I said, agricultural activities. The nature of water itself, you can't transfer that to a private entity and say, okay, you manage this water. For me, that was the main principle which I did not adhere to, where water can be given to a private entity to manage. Mm-hmm. And that's why I said my principle is water is much more than that. Mm-hmm. And therefore it should be in the public hands. And once you transfer that rights to the private entity, and of course, with my experience, private sector, they don't do charities. The main aim of an enterprise is profit maximization. Let's be clear and upfront about that. So water becomes business to them. Therefore, if you tell them to respect human rights and bring water to the people that need without charging them too much, it's good quality water, it becomes a challenge to the private sector.
Right. I mean, if we look at this then, the bigger picture, if we look at that demand, for water is set to grow a lot in the coming decades. What is happening right now? Is there a gold rush with companies taking over water supplies, or just how controversial is this privatization aspect right now?
Listen, a little bit of history here. The water services, the drinking water we're talking about, water is free in the nature. You can go get it, right? But if it comes to your doorstep, somebody has to pay that. Somebody has to produce that and bring it in a network to your doorsteps or in your homes, right? Mm-hmm. That has a cost, right? If you go back into the history, a little bit 200, 300 years or 400 years, it was the private sector, private capital, that really developed the water infrastructure in many parts of the world, especially in the developed world. And then in the early 20th century, things didn't go well, and therefore there was this concern about health issues, cholera outbreaks. And that's why the public authorities thought that this water is too important to be left to the private sector. Therefore, they took it back and they municipalized it, right? And then in the 1990s, this privatization rush started, where even loans, the Bretton Woods institutions, when they were giving loans, one of the conditions was you have to privatize your public infrastructure, including water. Come 2000s, and things didn't go that well. So the public sector is taking back the water. And then with COVID, I think there has been a little bit of the countries are again considering privatization because of the crisis. So this is the general trend we have observed as I said, if you go back to 200 to 300 years down the lane in the history, and right. I gave you some of the recent examples. Yeah.
But I mean, if I understood you correctly, historically, you were also saying that initially the money or the investment came from the private sector, and then it went back to the public. Then sort of there was another privatization drive. So it's a bit of back and forth historically. I mean, what does this mean for the rest of the world? I mean, where's the money going to come from if countries are too poor or governments haven't got the budget?
It's a very good question. As in fact, what the private sector is doing in terms of the investments, in fact, they borrow from the public banks too, right? With very low rates. So why can't the public sector do the same thing?
And is this happening?
It is happening. It is happening in many countries. In Malaysia, that has happened. Cochabamba in Bolivia and other places, they are doing the same things. Because one of the things that we saw was why there was this drive towards the private sector is that because of the conditionalities imposed by some of the regional banks or the Bretton Woods institutions like the World Bank and the IMF. So one of the conditions that these Bretton Woods institutions and other financial institutions were imposing was that they privatize, they sell some of their infrastructure, public infrastructure. Mm-hmm. So that was the problem. It was not by the goodwill of the government that they wanted to sell off the infrastructure. It was never that case, right? Mm-hmm. It was because of a third party who had much more leverage and influence in providing other loans to prevent the countries from crisis, that conditionalities was creating the biggest problem. I think even now, these Bretton Woods institutions are continuing with that. Even if you look into the latest trend, for example, in terms of what they are giving the money for private sector development, right? Mm-hmm. And if you see that recently there has been a lot of private investments, we can see that there in 2021 there were like 25 projects being privatized in the developing world, and that was the same amount as in 2010. All of a sudden, there has been a lot of activity going on just in the last year, where the World Banks, IFCs, are investing a lot in the water and sewerage business in the developing world.
If we perhaps then break this down a bit, for the consumer. Let's say we also take a consumer in the developing world. Let's just imagine a big company were to come in and take over the water supply, became privatized. I mean, what happens? What are the impacts on the ground?
What we have seen is that whenever the private sector comes in, the tariffs then start increasing. Not only the tariffs, but the connection fees starts increasing drastically. That is very harmful, especially to the consumers. At times they spend in many countries. I've looked into a few numbers where they spend like about 30% of their income goes to purchasing of water. Right? It's a huge amount, right? In some of the countries, and even in America, where there were some studies done, if I can remember, the private utility service cost like 59% more than the public water services. These are some numbers that there was some research done. In other words, 59% more, right? Mm-hmm. And in France, there was this city of Bayonne, where there was this price hike as soon as the private sector had come of 8.5 or close to 9% straight away. So the first thing the private sector does is increase the tariffs.
On that note, if you say that they hiked, you mentioned the example in the US up to 50 to 59% more, once private utilities took over. I mean, does that also then mean if they increase the price, I mean, I assume you also get a better service. Is the water better when private companies take over? Are they offering, healthier water to the consumer?
Very good question. And most of the research has found, in fact, it's no difference than the public sector. There were some recent studies in Paris where the municipal has taken over the water. In fact, the water is much more of better quality in Paris than it was delivered 10 years ago by the private sector.
If you could give us, an example perhaps where privatization, the worst example you can think of, where it's really gone so badly wrong in a nutshell, and perhaps you can also, I don't know, think of an example where privatization actually worked out rather well.
Yeah, that's a big challenge for me, to tell you frankly, where I won't be able to give you a good example where water has, the private sector has done extremely well. And it checked all the boxes and say fantastic. No, that absolutely no. But in terms of the worst case, there are like over 100 if you want. As I said, Bolivia, Jakarta's, even in developed countries. Argentina, many countries, Brazil, Malaysia was at certain point. India, Nagpur is going very bad these days. So it's. I can give you, for example, of Buenos Aires, right? Mm-hmm. They had a 30-year concession, right? From the 1990s and 2000, right? As soon as they came in, the water bills in Buenos Aires increased by close to 88%, I said, if I remember correctly, right? So that's what we call going bad, right?
And that wasn't related to inflation or anything like that.
No, the crisis came later in Argentina in 2002. That was later. I'm talking about 1990s. Mm-hmm. So of course, then increasing the water bill by 88%, like doubling the thing. It's bad for the consumers, right? Mm-hmm. In Cape Town, for example, one of the French multinational took over the water provision in Cape Town, right? Mm-hmm. 1994. 2 years later, the water company was charging like 600% more.
Wow.
These are numbers, that we have it, This is something going bad, right? I can give you, on and on and on in terms of why privatization has gone bad.
I mean, if we look at it from the private perspective, from a company that is operating this field or perhaps considering operating in this field, I mean, a lot of the technologies and the innovations, they come from the private sector, right? So they can play a very important role in improving standards, right, and access. So, I mean, it sounds like a partnership between public and private sector would be the way to go in future.
As you mentioned, that the private sector has the know-how, has the technology, at times has the capital. They are welcome to join in the water business, provided they respect the human rights obligation, is transparent, they respect the increasing of the coverage, and it's affordable. Those are the elements. These are non-negotiable. Mm-hmm. If they come in, these are the things that you put the red line and say, this is something that you have to respect if you want to enter into our business.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, if we just sharpen that a little bit, the role that the private sector could play in the future, I mean, they're not a charity, right? They want to earn money. Otherwise, they wouldn't be in the private sector. I mean, would you recommend a cap on profits, or how would you go about, trying to dampen that profit maximization drive taking over?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in certain countries could impose, for example, that X amount of profits from the business should be reinvested in the infrastructure. That's number one, right? Mm-hmm. But number two, as you mentioned, that the only thing that will be allowed should be that you are able to recover your capital, without too much, profit-seeking motives. Of course, there should be a cap, as you mentioned, and these are negotiated in the contracts. However, being part of the private sector and understanding what's happening around the world, looking at some of the studies and empirical research, private sector will always find an excuse and justify why it was not able to do that. And therefore, this asymmetry of information and this power imbalance with these big companies, with their lawyers and legal teams and technical experts, they overwhelm these public authorities, local authority officials, Mm. So they will be able to always find ways in order to circumvent whatever is stipulated in the India contracts. This is based on my personal experience and what's happening around the world based on the private sector's involvement in the water supply for the past 20, 30 years, that I can tell you about that.
Hmm. I mean, the private sector, I mean, it's a very abstract term. The companies involved in this, is there a concentration on the market? Are these companies becoming bigger and bigger? Or, I mean, is that maybe also part of the problem that, you've got stock listed companies who have shareholders who want returns? Or would it make more sense to also work with, smaller companies that haven't got these shareholders on the stock market?
Indeed. The smaller companies are there are certain countries who have better private sector, especially in some of the Nordic countries, Finland, Norway. I know they are very good in water, and they have a water fund in order to help developing countries with this private sector arm going to help developing countries. That's number one. Number two was indeed, there is this concentration of a few companies, especially the French companies, and they have these subsidiaries all over the world, right? In the UK, in US, and also in Africa, in Asia. So they have their subsidiaries, right? What we see is the general trend is that they are consolidating. Well, it's a very bad sign for the consumers. Smaller companies from certain regions, as I said, the Nordic countries, they have a different system of management where they are not too much interested in profit seeking, but more on the helping and investment in water business.
On a different note, Naren, according to the report, the world's water, which is updated every 2 years by the Pacific Institute, just under 65% of drinking water is located in just 13 countries. I'll just name a few: Brazil at the top, then Russia, Canada, US, Indonesia. I mean, that is quite a lot of water in just a small handful of countries. Are these countries, do you think, look into the future, could these be like the new Gulf states of water, sort of comparing it to the new oil?
Indeed, yeah. Water, although the world doesn't lack water, but the redistribution is a big problem, right? And that's where politics come in. And as you mentioned very well, these few countries have sufficient water, groundwater, especially in the Middle East, for example. Water is politics, and it's survival, So indeed, it can lead to a big problem if it's not managed well. Indeed, I mean, it's just common sense so that we can continue to live on this planet by sharing the resources that we have.
In terms of sharing, if we look ahead also, about 4 billion people, that's nearly 2/3 of the global population, they already experience severe water scarcity during at least 1 month of the year. You touched upon it earlier. And water demand is set to triple over the next 4 decades. I mean, just very pragmatically now, how do we solve this problem? What do we need to do?
We have to go bit by bit. First, recognizing the principles, as I said, you can't just jump in and say, okay, bring in the private sector. So first, you have to recognize the principles, and you can enshrine these in your national legislations or constitutions, whatever you want at the national level. And then you adhere to that, number one. Number two is making sure where there is lack of water or scarcity, as you mentioned, there is this common sense where people are able to share and live in a harmonious way rather than in a conflictual way. So that's the principle. Number two is so that there is fair redistribution and sharing done by all the countries so that we are able to save the planet. And number three is, as you pointed it very well, in terms of the water is also an environmental issue, so that we have to manage and protect the water so that we leave the world in a better place in terms of sustainability and giving the world as we inherited, or even better, to our children and grandchildren. So that's something that we have to work not alone in an individual world or in a country basis, but more in a global way. Of course, as we mentioned, that the private sector has a seat in these negotiations and discussions. But these are the three principles. You have to get it right before you start solving the problem.
Naren Prasad, water policy expert and head of education and training at the UN's International Labour Organization. Thank you very much for joining me here with On the Green Fence.
Thank you very much, Neil. It was a pleasure talking to you. I hope it is useful to the listeners. Thank you. Goodbye.
Okay, so time for my main takeaways from this episode. First off, according to Naren, privatization of water always results in higher tariffs. At the same time, water quality doesn't really improve. In fact, water standards actually improved in places where the public took back the water rights, such as in parts of France. What else? Yeah, the private sector, they can bring innovation, so they can play an important role in future. but only as long as they adhere to the principle that water is a basic human right, and that they don't take advantage of, weak governments or leadership to renegotiate contracts so as to maximize their profits, and no more cherry picking, as Naren put it. Also, I thought it was interesting that the development of privatization, just historically speaking, it hasn't been linear, but rather there's been quite a bit of back and forth these past 200 years, with companies dropping in and out and the public sector retaking control or ceding it again, when the funding got tight. So I thought that dynamic quite interesting, and it'll also be interesting to see how that's going to play out in future. Particularly if freshwater supplies do grow tighter. But, I think the main thing that I took away from this episode, talking to Naren, is that it all boils down to that water is a basic human right. And, it's people who have to ensure that this is respected, no matter whether they work in the private sector or for the government. That doesn't really matter, does it? So, maybe, I don't know, maybe it would make sense to sort of view water more like the air that we breathe. If we looked at it a bit more like that, because I don't think anybody's come up with plans to privatize air yet, but your water, just like air, is something, it doesn't belong to anyone, but it does impact on all if we pollute it, or try to sort of, stop others from using it. So, I think maybe that approach could help. Of course, it's not just companies that can make mistakes here, we've got to be upfront about that as well. Good governance is just as important as sustainable business models. And personally, I think, I don't think that generating profits is immoral by definition. But as Naren said, when it comes to water, a large chunk of these profits, they have to be reinvested in the water systems. It has to be ensured that this goal of universal and affordable water access is achieved, no matter who's in charge, private or public. And of course, that's something that should also be included, in big, fat, red letters in any contracts that are drawn up between the public and private sector. That's, my 2 cents for now. Please do let me know what you think. You can write me an email to onthegreenfence@dw.com, and I promise I'll get back to you without fail. Time for me to wrap up now. Many thanks to my colleague Natalie Muller and my sound engineer Gerd Georgi, and a big thanks, of course, to you for listening. Our next episode is going to be about water contamination, so do join us again for that. My name is Neil King. Take it easy and take care.